Hey guys, in today's video I want to go into React hooks. I want to go in depth on some of the hooks that we use most commonly in day-to-day React coding. So this includes the useState hook and the useEffect hook. And we're also going to be taking a bit of a look at the context API, so that includes the create context and use context. Although I want to focus more on the useState and useEffect hooks, since these are the hooks that you're going to be using much more commonly and are much more important to have a good understanding of. The reason I'm making this video is because I've noticed a move towards functional components over class components. And I think one of the reasons for this is that functional components have a lot of the functionality that class components have because of the hooks, and I think it's a lot easier to write and read code in functional components compared to class components. So to get started, you want to open up your IDE and then also open up your terminal. So I'm just using the integrated terminal here. You want to type npx create react app and then specify whatever directory you want. So / just specifies the current directory. So I've already run this and have all the files here. So you can see I have all the boilerplate create react app stuff. Let's also start up our development server. So we would run npm run start in our terminal here. So I've already run this and have it running in the background here. And this will just load up on localhost 3000 and give you the basic create react app boilerplate. Okay, so to get started, let's just remove some of this boilerplate code here. Let's first look into the useState hook. So let's import useState from React. The way that useState works is that it returns to us two things, or actually it returns to us an array containing two elements. The first one is state itself, and the second one is the ability to change that state. So set state if you're familiar with class components. So let's say state and set state. And you can name these whatever you want. A general convention is whatever you call this, you want to have this be the same except with set in front of it, and of course camel cased. So you say that is equal to useState, and you want to make sure to call this. And what you put here is actually your initial state. So what I want to do is create something like a user, which has a name, let's say John, and an age, let's say 21. And so I want this to initially have this structure. So I'm just going to cut that there and paste it here. So we're saying that initially this state object here, or the state value, is going to be this object with a name and age. So now what I'm also going to do is just rename this to user and this to set user. Once again, you can call these whatever you want, general convention, set, and then whatever this value here is, so user in our case. So I also want to show that on the front end, on the UI. So I want to say name is user.name, and then let's say age is user.age. So let's just save this and take a look at it. So here you can see we have name and age. And I'm also just going to console log the user state. So you can see we have this object with age 21 and name John. Okay, so now let's create a function called handle change username. So all this function is going to do is I just want it to change the user's name to, let's say, Jane. So if you're from class components, you would do something like this. If you're not familiar with class components, then just ignore what I'm doing. But in class components, you might be familiar with doing something like this. And you might be thinking that this is actually quite simple, and all you'd have to do is change this to this, remove the this keyword here, and it would work. Now, it's almost like that, but it's not exactly the case. So I'm just going to go through it from scratch. So the way that it works is set user, or the first index that you get here from useState, overwrites the entire state. So that means if you were to do something like set user, and you were to do name is Jane, and you were to completely disregard any thought for age, it would actually completely overwrite state with this object here. So that age property that we have here just completely disappears. It's no longer part of our state. And to show you guys that, let's just create a button. Change user name. So on click, I just want to attach that handle change username function that we created. So now so you can see here, right, initially it's name John and age 21. If I click this, the name has changed to Jane and the age is gone. You can see that it's not part of the object anymore. So this is just to show you guys that whatever you set here will overwrite the entire state, not just part of it. Another way of doing this, so this is one option you have to overwrite the entire state. So I'm just going to comment this out and show you guys the other way. So same thing, set user, but this time I'm actually going to give it a function, an anonymous function, where the value that you get here is actually your previous state. I often just call this prev, and since we only get one parameter, we can actually remove the brackets. So here we actually have our previous state, and the way that this works is whatever you return, so in this case I'm returning an object, will get put into state. So just to show you guys that this is actually working, let me say Jane, age, let's say 41. So if I click this, we get name Jane and age 41, and you can see here in the console log, it's reflecting that as well. So these are the two ways that you can set a state. You can either overwrite the entire object, and this is useful for things like if this was a boolean, then you don't really need to do this. You could just change the boolean to true or false or whatever you want it to be. And the reason that we do it like this is because let's say we only wanted to change the name here, which is actually what we're trying to do. If this is quite a simple object, but if this was more complex and we had a lot of fields, you might be thinking of doing something like age is user.age. But once again, if we had a lot of fields, then it would get really annoying and it wouldn't be maintainable, and it just generally isn't good code. So instead, we use the previous object here. We just spread it in, and that's it. So all of these values here will be spread into here, and then we're just only overriding the name value to Jane instead of John. So just to show you guys this in action, if I click this, the name changes to Jane and the age stays the same and is unaffected. So just to recap this one more time, the set user overrides the entire object. In our case, the object. Of course, this could be a string, a boolean, integer, whatever you want. So in this case, it's overwriting the entire object to be an object with whatever you want. In our case here, we only set the name, which means we're actually forgetting about the age property. So instead, we're going to use we're going to pass a anonymous function. And when we do this, the first parameter that we get is the previous state. And this is actually the only parameter that we get. And using that previous state, we can spread it in and then just set name to wherever we want. So in this case, Jane. So the reason this is useful is let's actually convert this to a handle change. So we're going to use this on an input. And let's just create a input here. Let's give this a name of name. And this name here is actually important. So this, I want it to be exactly the same as the key that we have. And I'll show you guys why this is important in a moment. I'm going to say the value of this is user.name. And on change, I want to call this handle change function that we have. Let's copy and paste this. Let's remove the button. And let's copy and paste this for age. So let's just say the name for this is going to be age. The value is going to be age, and the onChange is going to be the same. So we're using the same onChange for two inputs, and I want this to reflect to change the name. So the way that we would do this, I'm just going to remove this for now. Actually, I'll leave it in just so you guys have it as reference. So because this is on an onChange, we're getting the event object from JavaScript. I'm just going to do a event object.persist. And now what we can do is we can use this name here to change the object. So here's what I mean. So once again, we're still spreading in the previous state, except this time, what I want to do is set the name to the event object's target. So when we say event object.target, we mean this, and the name. So dot name. In case you're wondering why I'm putting this in square brackets, it's not because it's an array. It's because in JavaScript, when we have a key, you can see the keys aren't in double quotes. You can put them in double quotes, but they're not. So let's say we had something like key is equal to something else like username. If we were to do this, then we would actually just be doing this. So our state would actually just look like this. And that's not what I want. I want it to actually be this value here. So to do that, we just put this in square brackets. And as you can see from my IDE syntax highlighting, it's actually being used now. So then if we did this, it would do that to our state. I hope that makes sense. It's a bit confusing, but this is just so it assigns the actual variable's value to the key. Anyway, that's just an example. But what we care about is the event object's target name. So the event object, and then the target is this, and then just the name. So in this case, it would be name, and in this case, it would be age. So this is why I was saying it's important for the name here to reflect exactly what the keys here of these properties are in the object. And the value, that's just going to be the event object's target value. So whatever the user typed. So now let's test this out. Let's go here. You can see it's already John and 21 because we're initially setting it to the user.name. And then if I make some changes to this, John Doe, anything, you can see that here we're rendering the state, the user.name state, and it's being reflected. So whatever changes we make is being directly reflected here. So this is one way of using the set user hook, the useState hook in the set user method that it gives you, and using this method of setting user, so putting in an anonymous function where whatever you return is going to be put into your state, and where you also get the previous state's value. And this way you override the entire thing. So these are the two ways of using it, and this is a real world example of where you would actually want to use it, where you have many inputs and you only want one handle change because you don't want to, if this is a simple case where we only have two inputs, but often in forms you have many inputs and you don't want to have to create an onChange for each and every single input. You can create a generic one, and this is how you do it with the set state or with our set user function. So I hope that makes sense. So just to go through it one more time, we import useState. It gives us two values, the initial state or just our state, and our ability to set our state to whatever we want it to be. It accepts one parameter, which is your initial state. So it's going to be when the component first mounts. So in our case, we're saying it's going to be an object with a name and an age. And then here, when we're setting it, so one way of doing it is to overwrite the entire object. So this does the entire thing, not part of it, but the entire thing. So that's one way. And the other way is to give it an anonymous function where whatever you return from this function will be put into your state, will replace and overwrite your state completely. And the reason you want to do it this way, a lot of the time, not always, but just a lot of the time, is because you actually get access to the previous state. So I hope that makes sense, and that is how you use the useState hook. A lot of the times I just use this way. The rare occasion I completely override it is when I'm using a string or something like that as my state. So it's not an object, but just a string or Boolean or integer. So yeah, that's it for useState. Now let's move on to useEffect. So I'm going to remove all of this. I'm also going to remove all of this. And now let's take a look at useState. So from class components, you might be familiar with a couple of lifecycle methods. So one is component did mounts. You have component did unmounts. Component did update. And those are the main ones that you're probably familiar with. So you can replicate all of these and even add some additional functionality with hooks and with the useEffect hook. Let's import that. useEffect. One thing I'm just going to do is create some states here where the initial value is going to be true. And I'm just going to do state and just put a ternary operator here. So if it's true, I just want to show true, otherwise just show false. The reason I'm doing this is because I want some sort of way to update the state just to show that these are actually working. So this is just to update our component, cause React to re-render it, and hence trigger some of these to show you guys that it's actually working. Just create a button, update state. And when this is clicked, I'm just going to set state to the opposite of what state previously was. So let's first take a look at the component did update. I think this is the easiest one to show first. So the way that useEffect looks is you say useEffect. The first parameter is here you can see it's a callback, so it's an anonymous function that you provide. And the second one is an array of dependencies. So this is actually optional. If you don't put in any array of dependencies, then you end up with this, a component did update. So when the component updates, so that could be the state, that could be you get some updated props or new props, that could be maybe if you're subscribed to a context, then if the context updates, then this would also run. So this runs when component did update. So now let's just test that. So you can see it runs when the component first mounts because that counts as an update. If I click this, you can see we get a 2 here, so it's console logging it again because our state updated, which counts as a component update. So if I keep clicking this, you can see every time the component updates, this function here, so this callback, this anonymous function that we have, runs. So this is how you do a component did update. So I'm just going to comment this out. Next, let's move on to the component. So this is a slight variation of component did update. It's not something that you actually had in class components, but it's component, or let's say dependency did update. So when one of your dependencies updates, then certain code will run. And so let's see how that would work. So useEffect, we still do the same thing and pass the anonymous function. And the way that we do this one is we put in an array, we put in an empty array, and whatever you put in here, so let's say I put state, whenever state updates, then this function will get called again. So let me console log hello, let's say state updated. So every time state updates, then this console log will run again. And this also runs when a component first mounts. So you can see we have state updated, and that's because the state is initialized. If I click this, we get 2 here, so it console logged it again. A good way to show this would actually be to create another state. So let's say state 2. And let's say state 2. So the way that this works now is the first button updates this state here, and the second button updates this state here. And this useEffect is only listening for changes on state. So state updated will only run when the first button is clicked, not the second one. So let's test that out. So once again, we get it when the component first mounts. Let's clear the console. I'm going to click state update state, so the first one, and we are indeed getting console logs. Now let me clear the state again. This time I'm going to update state 2, and you can see we're not getting any console logs. And just to show you guys, so let me put 1 here and 2 here. So just to show you guys that our component is actually being updated. So you can see this is switching between true and false on the here. If you look here, it's switching, but we're not getting any console logs until we actually change state. Now this is an array, so if I put state 2, so whenever state or state 2 is updated, then this console log here will run. So state or state 2 updated. So let me clear this, and this time I'm going to update state 2, and you can see we get a console log here. Let me clear this again. Now I'm going to update the first state, and we get the console log. So you can have as many dependencies as you want here. So let me just leave state side of it for now. And let's just remove all this. So this is how you do it when a certain dependency updates. And also this could be a prop. So this doesn't have to be state. This could be some of your props. So we've done the component did update and dependencies did update. Let's next look at component did mount. So the way that this works is we have a useEffect. We once again give it the anonymous function. And this time, so remember, if we provide no array of dependencies, then anytime the component updates, whether that's props, context, state, then this will run. But instead, if we pass an empty array of dependencies, then this will only run when the component did update. So that's how this one works. So let's console log component did Oh, sorry, I mean component did mount, not update. Component did mount. So just to show that, you can see we get the console log first here, so the component's mounted. I'm updating the state, and there's no change. That's because we're not listening to any dependencies, so this will only ever run when the component first renders. So next, let's look at the component did unmount. So I'm actually going to create another component here to show this, because we're not actually unmounting the app component. So let's say second component. Let's just return hello world. So let's bring in the useEffect. Pass it the anonymous function like always. So you always pass in this anonymous function. And then let's say give it an empty array of dependencies. So console log. Let's put that here. So console log component did mount. Let's comment out this one. So I know I'm just doing the same thing, but let's just make sure this is working. And then let's do it with state here. So if state is true, I want to render second component. Otherwise, just render nothing. So when we when we toggle state, that's gonna mount and unmount our second component here. So you can see we have hello world, and it's mounted because by default state is true. So now if we set it to false, it's going to be null and unmount. And you can see here we get the component did mount. So we unmount it, remount it, and then we get that component did mount again. So to make this a component did unmount, so component did unmount, all we would have to do is just return. So let me just cut this, return a function. So return another anonymous function. And this function will only run when the component unmounts. Let's say component did unmount. So let's test this out. So you can see here, if I refresh the page, we get absolutely no console logs. Let me click this to unmount it, and you can see we get component did unmount. So whatever you return from here, so the same structure of a normal component did mount, except this time, whatever logic you want to run when the component unmounts, you do that by returning an anonymous function and putting that logic inside that function. So I know it's a bit confusing because we have two functions. We have one here, and then we have one here that we're returning. So all you need to know is this only runs when the component is unmounting. And a use case for this would be something like if, let's say when your component first mounts, or you could also do it here. So this is component mount. Let's say you do something like subscribe to an event listener. And then when the component unmounts, you actually want to remove that event listener. So this is where you do that. So I'm just going to leave this in here and comment this out. So I just grabbed an API endpoint. So this is just if I copy and paste this into here, you can see it's just some JSON with posts, so an array of objects with a body and a title. So a use case for component did mount, which is this one where we have an empty array of dependencies, is you might want to fetch some data. So if I just use the fetch API, so fetch this endpoint here, and this is a good way to point out something. You might be thinking of using async await. So you might be thinking I'd put async here, just await this. So response is equal to that. You actually can't do this. The reason for this is you can't put async on the effect itself. Instead, what you want to do is create a function as a fetch data, and then put all your logic inside here and make this async. And then here you just want to call fetch data. And then we just put this above it. So here you want to call your async function instead of putting async here. So that's just a little side note. And I think we also have to do JSON res is equal to res.json. And we have to await that. So I'm just going to set our state to just null, and then set state to this right here, JSON response. So this is one way you could fetch data using the component didmount, where you have your function here. I'm just using the fetch API because I don't want to install Axios right now. We get the JSON response data and we set our state. So now what we can do is, if we have state, we can just do state.map. If we look here, we get title and a body. So let's just do element key is equal to l.id. So that's this ID right here. And as for the content, I'm just going to put element dot let's say title. So now you can see we have all of this data here. If I just slow this down, you can see when the component's fast loading, nothing happens, and then when we get that data, it shows everything. So this is just a this is not a good way of fetching data. I don't recommend this since we don't handle any errors. We don't show a loader or anything like that. I'm just purely doing this to show you guys how you would fetch data in a really simple way with the component didmount hook. Okay, so finally, let's move on to the context API. So let's delete everything here. Delete all of this. We no longer need this component, and we don't need this either. Let's create a new file. Let's call this context. Let's say posts context.js. Let's import React from React. And I want to import the create context method. So the way that this works is to use the context API. First, have to create the context. You then have to provide that context. So you create a wrapper, which is going to wrap your whatever you want to provide that context to. So that could be only part of your project, or it could be your entire project. And then the way that you would actually use this, so after you provide it to your entire, let's say whatever portion of your project you want, you would use the use context hook. So that's a very high level overview. Now let's actually get into showing you guys how that works. Let's say I create a users context, a posts context, and that's going to be equal to create context. And what you provide here is actually just the default value. I'm not going to set that here. I'm going to set that somewhere else. Now let's create a post context provider. And let's return post context. So there's actually a component. So post context dot provider. And then here in our value is where we pass our initial default value. So this could be something like state. So let's say I grab state here. State and set state is equal to useState. Let's provide an array. Let's give it an ID of 1 and a post title of React hooks. We can then pass down this state into our value. And then here, I'm just going to grab the props and then do props.children. So the way that this works right now is we have this post context provider component. And inside here, we're just rendering the post context provider. So this is from our create context. So provider is given to us by create context. We're saying that the value that we want to pass down to everything that we wrap in this is state. So this state here is going to be passed down to all of the children that we wrap with this component. So in our case, I actually want to wrap the entire app project. So I'm going to go into app. Actually, let's go into index and wrap app with this. So that's import. Oh, and we have to also export this. So export posts, export default, posts context provider. And I also want to export this posts context. The reason for this is we're going to need this to actually grab this value. So let me just show you guys this in action. So if we import posts, post context provider from our post context, then we wrap post context. We wrap app in that. Now app has access to this value. So the way that we would access it is using the useContext hook. And then to use the useContext hook, we also have to specify which context we're using, because you can have multiple contexts. So here we could actually have multiple contexts that we're providing to our entire app. So we want to specify which context we want to use. So let's import post context. From post context here, let's say state. Let's say context state is equal to use context, and then specify the context we want to use. So I'm going to say I want to use the post context here. Next, I just want to console log that for you. So context state, and let's see what that looks like. So let me just put a message here. So this is context state. So here you can see context state is an array of objects. And here you can see we have that initial state. So we have this initial state right here. So the value that we pass down to this, right now I'm just passing one value, but we could also pass in an object where we say state is state, and we could also pass set state as set state. So now in our app, this would actually be an object of two things. So you can see we have our state here, which is the same as before. And now we also have the ability to mutate that state from anywhere. Common thing you might see is for it just to be destructured like this. And then we could just, let's say, map over our state. So do state.map, grab that element, give it a key of the element ID, and then element.postTitle. So here you see we have React hooks. So this might have been a bit confusing, so I'm just going to go over it one more time. We first create the post context using the create context function that is provided to us by React. We're also exporting this so we can actually use this context anywhere we want. We're creating a wrapper component where all this wrapper component does is it renders the post context provider. We specify which values we want to provide to our app. So in this case, I'm specifying that I want to provide an object which has state, which is our state here, and the ability to set state, which is the same as our set state here. And then I'm just rendering the props.children as normal. I'm then using that provider component that we created to wrap our app. So that means our app and any nested components within our app has access to this post context. Then to use that post context, we have to import useContext, specify the context itself, and then we just straight away get the values. Now remember, this only counts for components and nested components that are wrapped within our post context provider. For example, if app was here and we were to do something like this, then this wouldn't work because it's undefined since we haven't provided this context to app. So remember, it has to be nested within it like this. So I'm not going to go in any more detail into the context API since that could be a video in itself and it's a bit complex. And generally, I wouldn't even recommend using it like this. I would recommend creating custom hooks within your context here and just using those hooks. That way you can eliminate certain steps like having to call the use context. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I hope you found it useful. I hope you guys learned something from it. If you did, I'd appreciate a like. I upload lots of React videos on my YouTube channel, so if you're into React and want to learn more about it, then I'd recommend subscribing. So yeah, thanks for watching. Hope you guys enjoyed the video.